All right. Today we're going to begin talking about really one of my favorite people of all time, and that is Theodore Roosevelt. If you haven't noticed, I've got a lot of Theodore Roosevelt paraphernalia that's been given to me over the years, including, for some strange reason, 3 Roosevelt finger puppets. I don't know where people find them, but I just seem to acquire them. This is a picture of Theodore Roosevelt shooting Sasquatch, which is actually based on a real, or at least a somewhat real story, in which Theodore Roosevelt was a very, very big writer. He wrote over 40 books. He's the most prolific writer ever to be president of the United States. Wrote more published books than any other person. But he wrote a story about going to the woods and encountering a beast that he considered to be Sasquatch. And he talked about his encounter with Sasquatch in this, and so some artists took some liberties, and they have Theodore Roosevelt firing an AK-47, which obviously wasn't around in his day, and he's, for some reason, carrying an American flag doing it. But that picture, I think, kind of conveys the attitude of Theodore Roosevelt. Please take out your notebook. Okay, you'll want to refer to these things. A lot of this does not appear anywhere else. But to help you in your study for things like this, online what you'll see is I'm actually making a movie of this presentation right now. Okay, and I'm going to post that to YouTube, so if you want to go back, if you missed something, or if you know of somebody who's out, like for instance, Kaylin's out. Oh, she's not in her assigned seat, so I thought that she was out of her. Okay, she is here today. All right, that's good to know. So, you can go online and find a YouTube clip of this lecture. You can also get a PDF of all the notes too, okay? And that's under the progressive era. So let me get into a little bit about Theodore Roosevelt and his role as the progressive leader. Now, what we've talked about, we've introduced, you've read a little about, is progressivism on the state and local level. Most of what we'll be talking about is change on the federal level, change on the level of our national government. So, like a lot of movements, it starts locally. But why do you think progressivism needed to get some attention from the federal government? What do you think was the purpose of trying to get action on the federal level? Can meaningful change happen in our society without the involvement of the federal government? I mean, there are a lot of powers that the local state and local governments can do, but it's not nearly at all. So Theodore Roosevelt becomes that person. He becomes the person who carries out progressivism, and at least starts it, and be finished ultimately by Woodrow Wilson. And what makes Roosevelt, one of the things that interests me about Roosevelt was, when I was a kid and I saw the picture of Mount Rushmore and I looked at the 4 faces on the mountain, and for the record, those faces are Washington, Lincoln, Washington, Lincoln, no, Jefferson, and the last one, which one? Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, okay? And as a kid I thought, well, I understand, you know, Lincoln, Jefferson, and Washington, but what the hell did TR, as he's known by people who like him, what did TR ever accomplish to get his face on there? And then I came and I learned a little bit and I understood why. And that is because, in my opinion, Theodore Roosevelt saved this country from a revolution. He was the key to giving average, everyday people a feeling like government could, at least in some small ways, begin to represent them. And the other thing about Theodore Roosevelt that is pretty important is that he is somebody who really energizes the presidency. In the last presentation, I asked you to name a president from Abraham Lincoln to Theodore Roosevelt. Can anyone do that? One president from Abraham Lincoln to Theodore Roosevelt. One name. That's about 50 years' time. Clinton? No, he was in the 1990s. About 90 years after Theodore Roosevelt. Calvin Coolidge was in the 1920s. No, after Lincoln. Before TR. Yeah, Jake. Very good. James A. Garfield. Do you know anything about him? No. He got shot. That's something to know about him. Marilyn? William Howard Taft is the guy right after TR. Okay? Well, the point is, the reason why you may be scratching your brain thinking about these people is because most of them didn't do much of anything. Remember, what does the character of the wizard represent?
The president.
No, in our allegory on the Wizard of Oz.
Guy who doesn't.
Brendan.
Guy who does nothing.
A guy who does nothing. A guy who really doesn't accomplish very much, okay? Well, TR is the guy who changes that. Everything about TR was larger than life. TR, at the time of his taking the office, was the youngest guy ever to become president of the United States. And he invites a very popular man to the White House. His name is John L. Sullivan. He is the champion of the world. Back in a day and age when boxers boxed bare-knuckled, that means bare hands against face, and they would have no round limits. And John L. Sullivan was the heavyweight champion of the world. He invites him to the White House, and TR challenges him in a formal dinner to a spar. And TR misses and then gets a right hook to his left eye, and blood comes pouring out of his cheek. The Secret Service get kind of jumpy. I don't know if you saw this picture, but there was a guy, Obama was campaigning yesterday, and he gave Obama a bear hug, like he was a weightlifter, and he picked President Obama up off his feet, you know, in this big bear hug. And in the back, you see these Secret Service agents sort of going into their jackets. You know, they were ready to take this guy out. But TR's bleeding. He goes back upstairs. He gets blurry vision in his left eye, and he never really regains any vision in that eye. But he never told anybody that he got his vision hurt from the heavyweight champion of the world, because he fancied himself such a good boxer. He loved to eat. Everything about him was larger than life. For breakfast, he would drink coffee out of 22-ounce mugs. He ate 12 eggs for breakfast every day and 4 strips of bacon. And the result was the heart disease that killed him. He was at one point in time the most fit man ever to be president of the United States, and then later in life one of the more obese men ever to be president of the United States. He loved the environment. He loved the outdoors. But he loved the environment and the outdoors mainly because of the opportunity it gave him to kill animals that lived in the outdoors. He was in favor of segregation. He thought segregation was a good idea. He talked often about how he believed that there was a certain racial inferiority to African Americans. Yet he was the first man ever to invite an African American to the White House. That man's name, somebody you'll read about, is Booker T. Washington. He was a warmonger. He loved to kill people in combat. Yet he's the first American to win the Nobel Peace Prize. So he's a person of contradictions. He's somebody who in his time was inspirational to a lot of people. He had an energy, a vitality, a way of doing things that made him really stand out. I think my favorite quote from Theodore Roosevelt is, "The man who really counts in this world is the doer, not the mere critic, the man who actually does the work, even if roughly and imperfectly, not the man who talks or writes about how it ought to be done." But I think the quote that really separates himself and makes him sort of show his progressive ideals is, "This country will not be permanently a good place to live unless we make it a reasonably good place for all of us to live." Another one of his letters to his son, he wrote, "Don't hit a man if you can avoid it, but if you do hit him, put him to sleep." So Theodore Roosevelt is part of the progressive era. And if we were to look at America during the time of the progressives, it would look, in many people's minds, a lot like this monster you see here. This 8-legged, octopus-like monster. And what were the problems? The problem of monopoly. The problem of subways overcharging people. This is in New York City. The steel trust. The banking trust. The electrical trust. All of these various entities. Now, who can define what a trust is? We've already done it together. What is a trust? Jake?
It's generally a business combination that tries to develop a monopoly.
It is. It's a business combination that tries to develop a monopoly. That means that their goal is to hide the ownership of lots of different businesses to avoid the combination of these many different businesses. Now, as we go through this presentation, you're going to encounter two different kinds of questions that you'll be answering with the clickers that you just got. The first kind of question is called a your turn question. A your turn question is a question where I ask you for your opinion, and hopefully it sets up a little talk, or at least a little, we note and we look at what you guys think about a given political issue, and we can kind of poll you. The other kind of question is called an understanding check question. These are questions about the stuff that we literally just went over a couple minutes before. These questions count. Your participation in them matters, and your answers to them matter. So, your first understanding check question is the primary group behind the organization of the progressive movement was the who? A, labor unions. B, middle class. James.
What do you mean by primary group behind it?
Who started the progressive movement? And you do your own work. Three. 2, 1, 0, and end. And the answer, actually, is the middle class, which is B. Now, labor unions are not behind the progressive movement. Keep in mind that the progressive movement is of middle class people. We've talked about this before. They are the people that want to remake America on the top, and they want to remake America on the bottom. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about TR and his family background. Theodore Roosevelt was born sickly to a New York City Knickerbocker family. I'm sure many of you have heard of the team, the New York Knicks, which is short for the New York Knickerbockers. A Knickerbocker is somebody from New York City who is of Dutch ancestry, somebody who is related to the original Dutch settlers of New York. That means primarily, if you're a Knickerbocker, you're one of the old wealthy families in New York City. And when he was born, his father was told that he would not live much beyond the age of 5 years. He had severe asthma. He could barely see. He had a number of illnesses because his immune system was pretty weak. But his father refuses to accept the early death sentence for Theodore. He instead says, I'm going to, through the power of my own personality, remake Theodore, or as they called him in the family, Ppt. I'm going to remake Ppt into a physical specimen. And so what they did is they bought Theodore Roosevelt in a day and age when no one worked out, no one exercised. In fact, many people believed that exercise was harmful to your health. Theodore Roosevelt got a full spring set in his house. It was a very old kind of, Nautilus kind of machine in which there were springs attached to the wall. And he would spend hours and hours moving the springs so that he could add some bulk to his frame. He also ran, which at the time was kind of unusual. No one ran. Jogging isn't going to be invented until the 1970s, but he believed that running was going to be good for his lungs and improve his pretty sick asthma. Even though he was nearsighted and even though he was underweight, when he was 8 years of age, Theodore Roosevelt's dad, a man by the name of Theodore Roosevelt Sr., forced Theodore Roosevelt to take up boxing lessons. Remember, this is boxing in the 19th century, a very rough and tumble thing. And he signed him up, he was 8 years old, he signed him up for the 10-year-old division. Why? So Theodore would get his butt kicked and learn what it was like to get beaten up. And in one of his first matches, TR gets hit in the face. He goes down, he's bleeding on the canvas, and his dad is yelling at him from the crowd, "Get up, Ppt, get up." One in which the idea that it was effort, it was engagement, that was going to be the life's difference. Now, when Theodore Roosevelt is about 13 years of age, his dad dies, and his understanding of his father kind of stays with him. And it stays sort of like a young kid's understanding of their dad. And you know, little kids tend to look up, obviously, to their parents. And Theodore Roosevelt had this portrait of his dad, which was painted when he was alive, obviously. He had 5 copies of that portrait made. And even when he was president, he would have that portrait of his dad hang behind his desk to make it seem like his dad was always looking over the quality of his work. He believed that his dad was the most virtuous man who ever lived. And he was going to spend his life trying to live up to that. When he's 18, he goes to Harvard University. This is his freshman football picture at Harvard University. And I love this picture for a couple of reasons. First, it shows what the Harvard football uniform was. No shirt, short pants, and this little cotton skull cap. This was the extent of a football helmet in the 1870s. What was football like in the 1870s? Football was like war by another name. It was, you have a ball, you have 2 lines, you get the ball over the line by any means necessary. That is the rule. And so kids were getting killed, literally killed, playing football. Kids would get their nose kicked in, and the bone from the nose would go through their brain, and other kinds of tough things. Now, of course, Theodore Roosevelt thought that football was a great manly game, that it taught great manly virtues. But he wanted football to exist, and there were many people that were calling for the elimination of football and of all college athletics themselves. So one of his reforms is he creates an organization, oops, not the NAACP, the NCAA, which stands for the National Collegiate Athletic Association. The NCAA is the organizational body that makes sure that student athletes in college stay safe. That was one of his reforms. Yeah, Monica.
Can you repeat what that stands for?
The National Collegiate Athletic Association.
Yeah.
You're welcome. After he graduates from college, he becomes a cattle rancher. This is Theodore Roosevelt, a guy who was born in Manhattan. Hadn't spent any time at all out west. And he says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to become a cowboy by force of his own personality. So he goes down to his favorite clothier, which is Brooks Brothers, which is, if you haven't heard of Brooks Brothers, it's a very, very nice men's suit store. He goes to Brooks Brothers and he says, I want cowboy shirts. And Brooks Brothers goes, well, what material do you, we don't make cowboy shirts, but what material do you think they should be made out of? And he said, silk. Cowboys don't work in silk. But TR goes out to North Dakota with his silk cowboy shirts. He buys 5,000 head of cattle, and within 2 years they are all dead because he knows nothing about cattle. But he likes to think that he knows a tremendous amount about life out west. He comes back home from his experience as a cattle rancher, and he marries this woman right here. Her name is Alice Roosevelt, and Alice Roosevelt was considered the prettiest woman in New York City at the time, and married her. And they have a young daughter who grows up to be this woman right here. She is also called Alice Roosevelt. Alice Roosevelt, the daughter, would be probably one of the most remarkable presidential kids of all time. Quick, what are the names of President Obama's two daughters? Two. Sasha and Malia. Okay, Sasha and Malia. President Obama's wife name, Carly? Michelle, good. If you didn't know who the first lady was, that would be bad. So, Alice Roosevelt, though, is a crazy woman. She holds a few distinctions. The first is she is the first woman in Washington, D.C. to get a speeding ticket in an automobile.
This is the daughter? Or
This is the daughter, Alice Roosevelt. Okay?
First person ever.
First female person to ever get a speeding ticket in Washington, D.C. She was going 35 miles an hour, and the president got the ticket in the mail, and he paid the ticket, and they asked him in the White House, how can you run a country if you can't control a daughter? If you can't run your daughter, what kind of parent are you? What kind of guy are you? And as a parent, though, Theodore Roosevelt was incredibly indulgent. He had 8 kids, all of whom lived in the White House. The White House became a crazy kind of kid fun zone. One of the things that he liked to do at the White House is he liked to give his kids weapons, literal weapons, guns, that they would use inside the White House. So he bought his youngest son, Kermit, a toy cannon that fired real miniature cannonballs using real small amounts of gunpowder. And so Kermit would light these small cannonballs and he'd create targets on the wall of the White House, one of the bedrooms in the White House. And so staff members were going, "My God, Mr. President, I think they're attacking. Maybe you need to leave here." "Oh, no, don't worry about that. That's just my kid playing." And what kind of kid plays with explosives in the White House? He allowed his kids to own farm animals, and they brought the farm animals inside the White House. They had a pet goat, and Theodore Roosevelt had to replace the drapes in the blue room because the goat especially took to eating the blue room drapes and caused an amount of damage. One time the ambassador to the British Empire, or to the United States from the British Empire, came over to the White House, and Theodore Roosevelt was showing his kids how you can sled down stairs on a silver platter. You know, like a serving tray. So he's sitting on the serving tray sliding down the stairs. And he slides right in front of the British ambassador, and his aide says, "You have to forgive the president. He's 38 going on 6. Meaning he acts like he's 6 years old. Alice, though, was his favorite, and she was considered very, very beautiful in her day. She would go to cocktail parties, these formal White House events, and she would hide snakes down her blouse. And at a moment when she was speaking to a man that she thought was a bore, she would reach down the front of her dress, grab the snake, and then shove it in the face of a guy who was not suspecting. And the guy would freak out, and then she'd laugh at his expense. Theodore Roosevelt had this vice president. His name was William Howard Taft. He sadly has the distinction of being the most overweight man to ever be president of the United States. And William Howard Taft asked Alice, "Why do you always wear a big hat when I see you?" And she says, "Well, if I wear a big hat, that means you can never kiss me, because you won't be able to get into past the brim of my hat." Yeah. AJ.
No offense, but how do you know that any of these are true?
Because I've read books on Theodore Roosevelt.
And this is all like...
This is all true.
Okay.
One of the things Alice Roosevelt said that was very funny was she said she had an empty seat next to her at a dinner party, and she said, "If you haven't got anything good to say about anybody, please sit next to me," because it meant that you'd be a lot more interesting as a dinner guest. Well, Alice would be very controversial, but I think it also showed his sort of side as a parent. But in February 14th, 1884, TR's life would change in a very real way. His first wife, Alice Roosevelt, and his mother both die of scarlet fever on the same day, on Valentine's Day. And so if you look at here, this is TR's diary for that day. We know so much about TR, AJ, because he wrote diaries every day of his life, starting at the age of 7 and ending at 70. And his entries would be about 5 pages a day. And all of his kids wrote every day. And Theodore Roosevelt wrote thousands of letters, literally thousands of letters to his kids, all of which survive. So this is a guy who wrote a tremendous amount. So we know a lot about his life. Yeah?
Wait, is that his wife or his daughter?
His wife, Alice. So he's now a single man, and he's got a young daughter to raise. And I love the entry, X, "The light has gone out of my life," which is probably the saddest diary entry I've ever seen. So Roosevelt is shaken. He has to figure out what he's going to do. And he decides that what he's going to do is he's going to dedicate his life to making the world a better place. Now, what's a better place? Well, of course, it's a better place if TR says it's a better place. Meaning, he's going to fight using his maximum energy, and it's a considerable amount of energy. One thing that Theodore Roosevelt did every New Year's Day, he would get in front of the White House and shake hands for 2 hours with anybody who would come up to shake hands with him. And of course, people heard of this, and literally thousands of people came to shake the president's hand. And he liked to say that he could shake 30 hands in a minute, meaning that it'd take 2 seconds to shake hands. And that is really hard to do. But he was a very, very energetic person. And that energy is going to be dedicated to changing every aspect of the world that he comes into contact with. His first job after his wife dies is New York City Police Commissioner. How do you guys think people were selected to the New York City Police Department, say, around 1880? What's that? No, because people wanted the job. So, who do you think tended to get the job? If a lot of people were interested in doing it. Being a cop's a pretty good job, as jobs go.
Most fit people.
No, that would be decent. Whoever paid the most. Yes, in a sense, Carly. Whoever had the best political friends got the cop job. Now, does that mean that they're the best cop? No. So Theodore Roosevelt came up with an idea called civil service. Anybody know what civil service is? Jake?
Isn't it like this thing you need to pass, like a test, to become that position?
Exactly. It's a test. Can you read? Do you have the ability to think? And they pick the people from this pool. Now, what do you think training was like for New York City police officers back in the 1800s? Very, very simple training. Okay, your first day on the job. Here's your uniform. Here's a whistle. And here's a wooden club. Now, if anybody acts up, hit them with the club. If the club doesn't work, blow your whistle, and then more guys with clubs will come over and beat the guy too. That was how police work went. He figured out that the best way of making sure that you had decent police officers was to train them. And he created the first police academy in the United States. From that, Theodore Roosevelt moved in. He was considered an excellent police commissioner. He got rave reviews. And he then took on the position of Undersecretary of the Navy. And at the time that Theodore Roosevelt became Undersecretary of the Navy, the United States had an absolute joke of a Navy. It was ranked somewhere in the neighborhood of 26th in the world. Because of Roosevelt's dedication to the Navy and the idea that the Navy needed to improve, he convinced the President of the United States, a man by the name of William McKinley, that he had to spend a lot more money on the Navy. And by the time he ended his service as Undersecretary of the Navy, the U.S. has the second largest Navy in the world. Yeah, Marilyn.
Where are we now?
What year is this?
No, I mean like now, like where's it?
We have the largest Navy in the world. Yeah, Ryan.
What it start off at?
Like 26th. Now, can you guess who was number one?
Great Britain.
Yep, Great Britain. So, partly of his own, and we'll get into this in the next unit, partly in his own eagerness, Roosevelt resigns his position as Undersecretary of the Navy when hostilities break out between the United States and Spain. It's a conflict that's called the Spanish-American War. We're going to go over that in the next unit. But he quits and he creates his own cavalry unit called the Rough Riders. And he's allowed to recruit his own members. So he gets a bunch of his cowboy friends from the West, and he gets a bunch of his polo-playing rich snob friends from New York, and he makes a cavalry unit out of them. And when Roosevelt goes there, he gets involved in one of the very, very important battles in the Spanish-American War. It's called the Battle of San Juan Hill, in which Roosevelt, against advice from commanders, charged up a hill with the Rough Riders, outnumbered something like 4-1, yet he still took the hill, and he had a horse shot out from under him, got another horse, and wrote in his diary that day, "It was great fun, triple exclamation point. I killed a Spaniard with my bare hands, ... like a jackrabbit." And because TR was also into the hobby of taxidermy, that means stuffing dead animals. That was something that he took a shine to. One of his friends, one of his polo-playing buddies from New York, gets shot in the belly, and he's lying in the grass holding his gut. Roosevelt rides up next to him and bends over his horse and asks his friend, "Isn't this a great day to be an American?" as his friend is bleeding on the grass. From his fame as a military leader, he gets nominated for the governorship of New York. And in New York City, he's going to go after two different elements of corruption, because this is TR after all. The first is called Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall, another word for that is the political machine. What's a political machine? It's people who sell their votes for favors. You went over this last year probably. You learned about a guy by the name of Boss William Marcy Tweed, Boss Tweed, who was incredibly corrupt. Well, Theodore Roosevelt went after Tammany Hall, and everybody in New York, except for Tammany Hall, of course, loved him for it. Now, these people were Democrats, which, of course, is convenient, because Theodore Roosevelt himself is a Republican. But he has another target that he's going to go after, and that is Wall Street. Now, which political party do you think people in Wall Street are members of? Maryland? No, not the Democrats. They're actually members of the Republican Party. So he's a Republican, and he's going after Wall Street for their corruption. Monopolies, trusts, all those negative things. So the Republican Party is really stuck with him in New York. He's incredibly popular. The people love him, but at the same time, he's going after their big-pocketed supporters on Wall Street. So the big question is, what do you do with a guy who you need because he's incredibly popular, but at the same time, he's going after your core supporters? And what the Republican Party decided to do was to, quote, kick him upstairs to the vice presidency. Why do you think it would be better, or the Republican Party thought, it would be better to have TR as vice president than it would be to be governor of New York? Maryland. Exactly. And who do you think is actually more powerful? The Vice President of the United States or the Governor of New York? The Governor of New York. What is the Vice President's job?
Replace the president if he dies.
To replace the President if he dies. And so what they thought was TR would be the Vice President He'd serve his 4 years, and then he'd go away and he'd fade back into the woodwork. What they were not counting on, President McKinley getting shot at the 1900 World's Fair just a couple weeks after taking office. Now, the Republicans' worst fear has come to pass, which is they have a guy that they can't control who believes he's right, who has a point of view, and is going to try to change the country. Change it in a way that reflects him and reflects his values. Are there any questions at all? All right, that's it for today.
Okay.